200 years ago, in frontier Kentucky, an important religious movement began at the Cane Ridge Meeting House. A great revival meeting was held here in August of 1801, with thousands of people in attendance. After the revival, Barton Stone and 4 other Presbyterian ministers left their church and its Calvinistic theology and began a quest for spiritual freedom. The freedom to go back to the Bible as their only guide, and the freedom to be undenominational Christians. But Stone and the people in Kentucky were not alone in this quest. 10 years earlier, in Virginia, James O'Kelly and Rice Haggard had broken away from the Methodist Church.
The issue was freedom. They were very much opposed to the idea of one man, in this case Francis Asbury, ruling over all of the Methodist churches. They were very much convinced that each church should be able to read and study and understand the Scriptures for themselves.
In 1794, the O'Kelly people met at the old Lebanon Church near Surrey, Virginia, just across the James River from historic Jamestown. Today, a monument marks the site of that church, and its open Bible commemorates their determination to follow the Scripture. When they came to the question, what name should we wear, Rice Haggard had the answer. They should be Christians only. As this Christian movement spread to the west, Rice Haggard migrated to Kentucky, worked alongside Stone, and convinced Stone that they too should begin wearing the name Christian.
I understand that this is the old log house that the Rice Haggard family lived in when they came to Kentucky. What can you tell me about it?
This log house was built in the 1790s, and the Haggards lived in it beginning about 1812 until his death in 1819. And then his widow lived here until the 1820s.
This glass part wouldn't have been here in those days, would it?
No, it was just a dog trot house built out of poplar logs.
What about Rice Haggard? How's he connected with Barton Stone?
Rice Haggard came to Kentucky to visit the Christians in the West in 1804, and he suggested to the Stone people that they just use the name Christian and just follow the Bible and just be Christians only. And a short time after this, the Stone people met at Cane Ridge and drew up the last will and testament and dissolved the Springfield Presbytery.
So, had Rice Haggard made that same suggestion to James O'Kelly earlier?
Yes, 10 years earlier, in 1794, at the old Lebanon Church in Virginia, he had made the same suggestion to the O'Kelly people that they just use the name Christian.
So Rice Haggard then is a link between James O'Kelly and Virginia and Barton Stone here in the West.
Definitely, and he's one of the reasons for the unity, the uniting of these two movements in the West.
But Barton Stone faced many problems as he led the Christian movement in the West. The flame that he had lighted in Kentucky flickered and might have been extinguished if Stone had not been a man of great determination and faith. One of the problems that he faced was the hardship of life on the frontier. Building a cabin and making a crop were challenges enough for most men. Stone had married Eliza Campbell just a month before the Cane Ridge revival. She was 17. They lived in a log cabin near the meeting house, and Stone and his young bride had to cope with hard work, poverty, and isolation.
He wrestled with poverty for years and was not a wealthy person at all. This was part of the frontier struggle for livelihood. And he talks on more than one occasion about having to plow all day, taking his notebook to the field with him, and then at night when others were resting, trying to put his ideas together and study things out.
Life was harsh and demanding for all women on the frontier, but it was especially hard for a woman whose husband was a preacher and was often gone on preaching trips.
They stayed at home and managed things while Mr. Stone or Mr. Campbell were out evangelizing. And I thought some about how resourceful and how competent they were and how full of faith. It's almost impossible today to imagine how isolated and how hard life could be for a woman on the frontier. She had very little access to medical care for herself during pregnancy or during delivery. She faced tremendous physical labor, pulling a plow herself if necessary, long hours of solitude and of responsibility without her partner present. Really, those were remarkable women of faith.
Stone's strong opposition to slavery compounded the work he and Eliza had to do and added to her burden of loneliness.
He did not have slave help, as some farmers did, and he commented that he would have to work long after others were in bed in order to tend to his own crops and so on.
He struggled with poverty all of his life.
Another problem that Barton Stone faced was a new religion that appeared in Kentucky in 1805 and threatened to undo Stone's work. 4 of the Christian preachers left Stone and embraced the new religion.
They were nicknamed the Shakers. The world's people gave them the name the Shakers because of their dance. And this whirling, twirling, laboring dance that they did when they went to the meeting house. So they preferred to be called the Believers, but no one could remember that, so they nicknamed the Shakers. The Shakers learned to accept it and even used it as a trademark on some of their products.
They were called Shakers because if they did something bad or out of line that week, they'd go up to church on Sunday morning and shake it off. And that's what they did.
The Shakers were drawn to Kentucky by news of the Cane Ridge revival. In January 1803, 3 of their leaders left New York and walked to Kentucky. They first contacted Barton Stone, then established a communal village at Pleasant Hill. This village has been restored, and today it gives visitors a picture of the Shaker way of life nearly 200 years ago.
Now, we just have a living history museum here. So now we have 2,700 acres, 30 original buildings, all on the original site, and it's the only historic place that you can tour and stay and eat in all original buildings.
Ann Lee was the founder of the Shaker religion. She came from Manchester, England in 1774, settled in New York, and then her missionaries went out and established 19 Shaker villages.
There was a great revival going on in Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia, and all throughout the area. The Mother Church in New York found out about this, and she sent out 3 missionaries. Some of my ancestors were over there on Cane Ridge.
Tell me about it.
And this revival started on this part of the world in about 1801. So they had a little opportunity to hear about it, and they came down and see what's going on.
And this was the start of Pleasant Hill. It grew to be over 5,000 acres. They had over 500 members, and they built over 266 buildings.
Many of the Shaker crafts are still practiced at Pleasant Hill.
And she's weaving cloth on the loom using a pattern called Conestoga. It took us about 4 days to thread the loom for this pattern. Even though it's only 15 inches wide, there are about 500 threads on the loom. The pattern actually is, the loom is actually about 165 years old. It's the youngest of the 4 looms in the room, the oldest being the one behind me. It's over 200 years old. And we have it set up for a coverlet as well. And that's about 10 days of work, threading the large loom.
In this little fireplace room, it takes about 10 or 12 feet of wire to make the broom. It takes about 1 pound of straw. It takes about 30 minutes of someone's time to make a Shaker fireplace broom.
And this is called carding the wool, and that simply means to get all the fibers going in one direction, get all the lumps out, and get all the dirt out. The Shakers had wool, all the wool that they needed here in the village, for all their clothes.
The Shakers built their own furniture, including spinning wheels. Original Shaker furniture is now highly prized.
All I'm doing to make this thread is to thin the fibers. And this flax wheel is doing all the work for me. It's spinning the fibers through the spindle and winding it on the bobbin.
Following the teachings of Mother Ann Lee, the Shakers held some strange beliefs.
They danced and they shook violently and shook their sins out in their mind. They were ridding their body and their soul of their sins by this religious dance that they did.
They believed that Christ was going to return to earth in their lifetime, They saw no need to multiply. They lived as sisters and brothers in their religion.
The tenets of the Shakers were that they believed in celibacy, open confession of sins, separation from the world, and communal property. Now, if you found out that you couldn't live this strict a life, you simply didn't join the Shakers.
This is the Shakers meeting house, where they danced and shook in their worship to God. Some of their beliefs would seem very strange to us. Mother Ann Lee believed that she was the female incarnation of the deity, and she believed that the mystery of iniquity spoken of in Scripture is sex, and therefore they practiced a total celibacy. But the Shakers were deeply religious people, and there are many things about them to admire.
Hard work was one of the greatest. They believed work was a part of their religion. Work was, and they really worked too. I mean, they stayed long hours. Sun up would let them go out to work, and sundown drive them in.
Eventually, the term Shaker stood for excellence in everything.
And today, the Shakers are remembered for their architecture and their simplicity in their furniture.
I think they were a very peaceful people. I think they were a fun-loving people. Of course, they loved to sing and they loved to dance. That tells me a lot. They were very religious people. They lived their religion every day.
And another thing about the Shakers, they were believing equality. They liked women just as well as men. If I was a trustee, well, they could be one too.
But the Shakers established a good name. They it was a fine agricultural community here. They seemed to excel in all their agricultural products. You knew if you joined the Shaker religion, you would have probably the best life that you could find anywhere.
When we visit the restored Shaker village here at Pleasant Hill, we step back in history nearly 200 years to the world where Barton Stone lived. In 1805, Barton Stone met the three missionaries who came from New York, the very men that established this village, and he argued with them about their faith. But a short time later, Matthew Houston, a young preacher of the Stone movement, embraced Shakerism and gave them his farm, the first land that they received in the West. Later, two other influential Stone preachers, Richard McNamara and John Dunleavy, became a part of the Shaker movement. At the time, it seemed to be a very tragic blow to Barton Stone, and he worked hard to offset the influence of the Shakers. But a few years later, some of the Christian preachers were looking back. They said that it might have been a blessing in disguise. If these men had remained in the movement, it might have been far more emotional, far less biblical. So perhaps the Shakers were a blessing in disguise to Barton Stone.
Stone's work was also threatened by personal tragedy, the death of his wife Eliza in 1810. She was only 26 years old, but such tragedies were all too common on the frontier.
Many women did not live very long. Maybe they died in childbirth with a third or fourth or fifth child, or with flu or some other disease. There were just, the mortality rates are just appalling.
When Eliza died, Stone was left with 4 small daughters.
He felt still such a call to ministry that he literally farmed his 4 younger daughters out to various families in the neighborhood and went on the road in full-time evangelistic work for the next year and a half.
And he says in his biography that he broke up housekeeping, boarded his children with the brethren, and set off with a preaching tour with another brother who had recently suffered the same loss. And later in that paragraph, he says, "We visited our children occasionally." As a mother, that is difficult for me to see.
It must have been difficult for Stone, too. He knew his daughters needed a mother, so he married again.
Stone's first wife, Eliza, died in 1810 after 9 years of marriage, and Stone waited 18 months, then married a Tennessee girl, Celia Bowen, who was a cousin of his first wife. She had grown up in this historic old home just north of Nashville, built by her father in 1787. Stone and Celia were married in this home.
The Bowen house is the oldest brick house in Middle Tennessee. The brick were fired right on the site. It was finished in 1787.
After Barton and Celia married, he built a small house on the Bowen farm.
And for the next 3 years, they lived in a small house here on the farm while Stone preached and planted churches in Middle Tennessee.
Thus, throughout all of Middle Tennessee, you will find churches that can trace their origins to Barton W. Stone.
Stone might have spent the rest of his life in Tennessee, except for a misunderstanding between him and Celia's widowed mother.
Well, he was under this understanding that he would get part of the Bowen property, but when it came to a realization that he was only being lent the property for his use and would not gain title to it, then he gave up on his part of the agreement.
Disenchanted and without land in Tennessee, Barton and Celia moved back to Kentucky, living first at Lexington, then Georgetown. The last 10 years had been hard for Stone. Life was harsh on the frontier, and he had to work long hours to feed his growing family. This left too little time for study and travel and evangelizing. He lost some of his closest co-workers to the Shakers, and he lost his wife Eliza and had to break up his family to continue preaching. Lesser men would have quit, but not Stone. As he returned to Kentucky and preached at Cane Ridge again, the most productive years of his life lay ahead. Empowered by the love of God, he had struggled to keep ablaze the fire he had kindled, and in the years to come, that fire would spread all over the West.